Today we're looking at narcissism. So to kick things off, this lecture starts with the story of Narcissus from Greek mythology.
Oh, that myth of Narcissus has really shaped how we think about ego and self-love. So Narcissus, he was this guy known for being incredibly beautiful.
Right.
But there was this prophecy saying he would only live a good life if he never actually saw how he looked. He rejected everyone who tried to get close to him. But then he falls in love with his own reflection. He sees himself in a pool of water and becomes totally obsessed with his reflection. He was so fixated on his own image.
And he dies.
He wastes away, totally unable to fulfill that longing, and eventually turns into the flower, the narcissus. It's almost like that myth predicted our modern-day obsession with selfies.
Yeah, that's true.
But anyway, the term narcissism actually started appearing in psychological literature back in the mid-1800s. And back then it was used to describe someone who was, totally absorbed in their appearance, their talents, their status, all of that.
So how did people view it back then?
At first, they saw it mainly as a phase that kids go through as part of development. And then over time, psychologists started to see it not just as this phase, but as a personality trait that everyone has to varying degrees.
Oh, interesting.
And of course, in its most extreme form, it becomes a clinical disorder.
So it's really come a long way from ancient myths to kids' phases to personality trait. I'm curious, though, were there any specific people who really helped shape how we think about narcissism?
Oh, definitely. One of the most influential figures was Sigmund Freud. He saw it as a developmental stage, linking it to our basic survival instincts, and he also thought it involved identifying with this ideal version of yourself.
So it's not just loving yourself, it's like believing you're better than everyone else.
In essence, yeah, and that idea of trying to live up to this often unrealistic ideal self is still really relevant to how we understand narcissism today.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because in the mid-20th century, narcissism really started to gain traction as a personality disorder. And that kind of coincided with the rise of what they call the me generation.
Yeah, totally.
Do you think there was a connection there?
I think so, yeah. Thinkers like Heinz Kohut and Otto Kernberg were key in shaping how we see narcissistic personality disorder. Through their work, and the changes in society and culture back then, with the emphasis on individualism and self-fulfillment, I think that probably contributed to narcissism being recognized as a potential problem.
Yeah, it's almost like we're living in a me generation right now with social media and reality TV.
Yeah, it makes you wonder about our culture.
For sure. So we've gone from ancient myths to developmental phases to personality traits. And now it sounds like maybe even entire societies can be narcissistic.
The idea of narcissistic culture kind of came about to explain these trends in society towards self-absorption and focusing on image over substance.
And I think it's interesting that this lecture breaks it down into different types. So let's start with what I think most people are familiar with, grandiose narcissism. It's like that stereotypical image of a narcissist in movies and TV shows.
So we're talking about people who are bold, charming, attention-seeking, and they have this inflated sense of how important they are.
Someone like, I don't know, a charismatic politician or a demanding boss.
Yeah, perfect examples.
Even like fictional characters. What about Dr. Strange?
Yeah, exactly. And with grandiose narcissism, it's all very outward-facing. They're all about self-promotion and finding any chance to shine, to be in the spotlight.
Okay, so they really need that constant praise and admiration.
You do, yeah.
Like Dr. Strange, he's brilliant, he's the best surgeon, and he definitely lets everyone know it.
Yes. But that's actually where the vulnerability comes in.
Oh, how?
Their self-worth is often tied to external validation, achieving power, recognition, all that. So when something threatens that, like when Dr. Strange loses the use of his hands, their whole sense of self can fall apart.
That's a good point. It's like they haven't built up that strong internal sense of self. Okay, so that's grandiose narcissism, but what about vulnerable narcissism? How is that different?
Vulnerable narcissism is more hidden, more defensive. On the surface, they might seem anxious or even depressed, but underneath it all, they still have that belief that they're exceptional.
So even though they might not be seeking out the spotlight in the same way, they still think they're special and deserve recognition.
Exactly. It's just a more fragile kind of narcissism where they're super sensitive to criticism and worry about not being recognized for their talents.
It's like they expect everyone to just know how brilliant they are without them having to prove it.
They often feel misunderstood and resentful that they haven't gotten the recognition they think they deserve, even if they haven't really earned it.
Yeah, so it seems like both types involve a sense of superiority, but they express it in really different ways. Someone with grandiose narcissism might actively seek out attention and admiration, while someone with vulnerable narcissism might be more passive-aggressive or withdrawn. Like, they're expecting others to just recognize their brilliance without them doing anything.
Exactly.
And I guess that difference is important because it explains how those two types can affect relationships differently, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Someone with grandiose narcissism might manipulate or exploit people to get what they want.
Yeah, potentially causing more harm to others.
And someone with vulnerable narcissism might struggle more internally with feelings of inadequacy and resentment, which could make it hard to form close relationships.
Yeah, it's almost like they sabotage their own relationships without even realizing it.
That makes sense.
And that's why understanding these little nuances is so important when you're trying to figure out how to deal with people who might have these tendencies.
How do we even know if someone is a narcissist? Are there tools that psychologists use to measure it?
Yeah, luckily, researchers have developed quite a few tools for measuring narcissism.
Okay.
And it might surprise you, but one of the most common methods is using self-report measures.
You mean just asking people questions about themselves?
Yeah, pretty much.
It seems too easy.
It does, but you'd be surprised how accurate self-reporting can be when it comes to narcissism.
Wait, so you're saying narcissists are willing to admit they're narcissistic?
In situations where there's no benefit to lying, if they don't think it'll affect them negatively, they're often pretty open about it.
So it's like they're proud of it.
In a way, yeah, if they truly believe they're superior, then why hide it?
Okay, that's an interesting perspective. But what about in those high-stakes situations?
Like job interviews or clinical evaluations.
Yeah, people try to present themselves in the best light possible then, right?
Absolutely, and that's why in those cases, researchers and clinicians often use other methods too.
Oh, okay. What?
Like peer reports, where they get information from people who know the person well, or structured clinical interviews.
So they use a combination of methods to get a more complete picture.
Exactly.
And then there are these like scales that psychologists use to actually measure narcissism. Right? What are those like?
Oh, there are quite a few, and they're pretty fascinating.
Heck, God.
For example, there's the single-item narcissism scale. They call it self-enhancement, and it's literally just one question.
Wow, really? What's the question?
It asks, to what extent do you agree with this statement, I am a narcissist? And then there's a note explaining that by narcissist, they mean things like being egotistical, self-focused, and vain.
Wow, that's amazing that one question can tell you so much.
It is, right?
Okay, is that the only scale, or are there others?
Oh, no. For more detailed assessments, they use the Narcissistic Personality Inventory, or NPI. And that one's a lot more detailed. It has 40 items, all designed to capture those feelings of grandiosity and self-importance that go with grandiose narcissism.
Is there a similar tool for measuring vulnerable narcissism?
Yes, there is. They often use the hypersensitive narcissism scale, or HSNS, for that.
Okay.
And that one measures the more defensive and sensitive side of narcissism.
I see. So what kind of questions are on that one?
Some examples are, I feel that I'm temperamentally different from most people. My feelings are easily hurt by ridicule or the slighting remarks of others, or I dislike sharing the credit of an achievement with others.
Wow, it's fascinating how even those questions highlight the difference between grandiose and vulnerable narcissism, right? One is all about being in the spotlight, while the other is about protecting a fragile ego.
Exactly, and recognizing that difference is so important.
Yeah.
It helps us see that narcissism is complex. It's not just a simple label we can put on someone.
All right, so we've been talking about individual narcissism, but I know the lecture also touched on something called collective narcissism.
In collective narcissism, that focus on grandiosity, it shifts from me to us.
Okay.
It's about believing that your group, whether it's your country, your political party, or even your favorite sports team,
Right.
that your group is superior to all others and deserves special treatment.
So instead of I'm the best, it becomes we're the best.
Exactly. And anyone outside that group is seen as inferior.
That makes sense. So it's like extreme patriotism, where people think their country is the only one that matters and might even be threatened by other countries' success.
Yeah, that's a good example.
And I imagine that can lead to some pretty serious problems.
It can, yeah, because if every group truly believed they were exceptional and deserved preferential treatment, that sets the stage for conflict and prejudice.
Okay, so what about communal narcissism? How is that different?
Communal narcissism is a bit more subtle, and at first glance, it might even seem positive.
Yeah.
It's about believing that you are exceptionally helpful, caring, and morally superior to others.
So it's like those people who are always volunteering for everything and talking about how much they're helping others.
Exactly.
But maybe there's a less selfless motivation underneath it all.
While those qualities might seem admirable, the real motivation is still about boosting their own ego.
So they want that recognition for their exceptional goodness.
Yes, and they might even get resentful if their efforts aren't recognized or reciprocated.
It's like they're trying to win a niceness Olympics or something.
Huh. That's a great way to put it.
It reminds me of that classic church lady character from Saturday Night Live, always trying to outdo everyone with her good deeds, but with this underlying judgment.
That's a perfect example because communal narcissism can be really sneaky, hiding behind kindness and helpfulness when it's still about feeding that need for recognition, just like other forms of narcissism.
Okay, so we've got these different types of narcissism, but how does it compare to other personality traits? We all have moments where we're self-centered, right?
That's true, yeah. But what sets narcissism apart is how intense it is, how persistent it is, and how it negatively impacts relationships and well-being. It's a pattern of behavior, not just an occasional slip-up.
So how do we tell the difference between narcissism and something like high self-esteem?
Yeah, that's a common misconception. People think they're the same thing, but they're really not.
So someone with high self-esteem, they genuinely like themselves and feel confident, but they don't necessarily think they're better than everyone else.
They feel worthy and capable, but that doesn't translate into a sense of superiority or a need to exploit others.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah,
And then there's entitlement, which always seems to come up when we talk about narcissism.
absolutely. Entitlement is a core part of narcissism. It's that unshakable belief that you deserve special treatment without any real justification.
It's like those people who cut in line or demand the best table at a restaurant just because they think they're more important than everyone else.
Exactly. But while entitlement is strongly linked to narcissism, it's not the whole story.
Okay, now for something a bit darker, I've got to ask about the dark triad of personality traits.
The dark triad is basically a cluster of 3 personality traits. They all share a common thread of being callous and antagonistic.
Got it.
And those traits are Machiavellianism, grandiose narcissism, and psychopathy.
Wow, okay, let's break that down a bit. Starting with Machiavellianism, what does it actually mean to be Machiavellian?
The term comes from Niccolò Machiavelli. He was this Italian philosopher and writer, famous for his book, The Prince.
Okay.
And Machiavelli, he basically advocated for using cunning and deception as ways to gain and maintain power.
So someone who's high in Machiavellianism is basically a master manipulator.
You got it. They're strategic, calculating, often very charming and persuasive, but their ultimate goal is personal gain, no matter the cost to others.
It's like they see other people as pawns in their game. Okay, so we already talked about grandiose narcissism, so let's talk about psychopathy. What makes that one stand out?
Psychopathy is the most extreme and potentially dangerous trait in the dark triad. It's characterized by a lack of empathy, impulsivity, disregard for social norms, and a tendency towards antisocial behavior.
So it's not just about being selfish, it's like a complete lack of concern for others.
Individuals high in psychopathy, they don't experience guilt or remorse even when they hurt others.
That's pretty scary.
It is, but it's important to remember that these dark triad traits, they exist on a spectrum. It's the extreme levels combined with a lack of positive traits like empathy and compassion that become a problem. It's about recognizing patterns and understanding that these are complex personality constructs.
That makes sense. I know the lecture also mentioned a couple other triads. The vulnerable dark triad and the light triad.
So the vulnerable dark triad, that one's interesting. It combines vulnerable narcissism, borderline personality disorder, and secondary psychopathy, which is a more anxious form of psychopathy.
Okay, so it's like the dark triad, but with this added layer of emotional vulnerability.
Yeah, you could say that they might still manipulate and hurt others, but they also struggle with a lot of insecurity and fear of abandonment.
That's a really interesting distinction.
It is.
Now, for the positive side, tell me about the light triad.
This one focuses on the good side of human nature. It includes humanism, faith in humanity, and Kantianism.
Okay, I'm not familiar with all of those terms.
Sure. So humanism is the belief that humans are inherently good and have the potential to grow.
Okay.
Faith in humanity means believing that people are generally trustworthy and kind. And Kantianism is about valuing honesty and fairness over manipulation and self-interest.
So it's like the opposite of the dark triad.
Exactly. It's all about empathy, compassion, and integrity.
I like it.
And research actually shows that people who score high in these light triad traits, they tend to be more cooperative and helpful.
It's good to hear about some positive qualities, especially after delving into the darker side of personality.
It's a good balance.
So I'm curious, what actually contributes to someone developing narcissistic traits?
That's the big question, isn't it? Nature versus nurture.
Is it one or the other?
The research suggests it's a bit of both.
Okay.
Twin studies have shown that genes play a significant role, maybe accounting for 40 to 60% of the variability in narcissistic traits.
Wow, so some people might be predisposed to be more narcissistic.
It seems that way, but it's not like there's a single narcissism gene. It's
Right.
likely a complex combination of genes.
Okay, so genes might load the gun, but does parenting pull the trigger?
Parenting definitely plays a role, but it's more complicated than just saying that certain parenting styles create narcissistic kids. Research suggests that both overly indulgent parenting and overly critical parenting can contribute to narcissism, but in different ways.
Okay, that makes sense. If parents are always praising their kids, even when it's not deserved, those kids might develop an inflated sense of self-importance.
Exactly. They might grow up expecting special treatment and struggle when they face setbacks or criticism.
And on the other hand, if parents are always criticizing and putting their kids down, those kids might develop a fragile ego.
They might develop vulnerable narcissism as a way to protect themselves.
So it's about finding that balance between supporting your child's self-esteem without inflating their ego.
Absolutely. And remember, parenting is just one piece of the puzzle. There are other factors too, like peer influences, cultural values, and individual experiences.
It's never just one thing.
No, never.
Speaking of demographics, are certain groups more likely to be narcissistic than others?
That's an interesting question. Studies have consistently shown that men tend to score higher on measures of narcissism than women, especially for grandiose narcissism. It's hard to say for sure, but some researchers believe it might be related to societal expectations and gender roles. Men are often encouraged to be assertive and competitive, traits that are also associated with narcissism.
So it could be partly because of that boys will be boys mentality.
It's possible, but we have to be careful about generalizations.
Absolutely. What about age? Does narcissism tend to change as we get older?
Generally speaking, narcissism tends to peak in young adulthood and then decline with age. As people mature, they typically develop more self-awareness, empathy, and a more realistic view of themselves.
I guess life has a way of humbling us all.
It does.
I had a pretty simplistic view of narcissism. I thought it was just about people being like arrogant and self-centered.
Yeah.
But it's so much more nuanced than that.
It really is, and I think it's about understanding those different ways narcissism can show up, the motivations behind it, and the impact it can have,
Yeah,
not just on individuals, but on society too.
definitely. So let's bring it back to the listener for a second. Have you ever come across people who show signs of either grandiose or vulnerable narcissism in your own life?
I think that's a great question for everyone listening to consider. Think about your own relationships. Have you ever felt manipulated or used by someone who seemed to have a really inflated sense of self-importance? Or maybe you've known someone who seemed insecure and sensitive to criticism, but also they had this underlying belief that they were special.
Those are really good points to think about. I know for me personally, learning about vulnerable narcissism has been really eye-opening.
Yeah.
I think it can be easy to miss because it's not as in-your-face as grandiose narcissism.
You're right. Vulnerable narcissism can be harder to spot because it hides behind things like anxiety and insecurity.
Yeah.
But understanding those subtle signs can be so helpful for navigating those relationships.
Exactly. And it makes you realize that sometimes those self-deprecating comments or that constant need for reassurance could actually be coming from a place of thinking they're special and deserve to be treated that way.
It's not always just low self-esteem. Understanding how narcissism works can help you set boundaries, protect yourself from being manipulated, and maybe even help those who are struggling with narcissism to get professional help.
That's such an important point because so often we just keep falling into these unhealthy patterns without even realizing it.
Exactly.
But being aware of it can help us break free.
Yeah, it's all about paying more attention to our interactions and understanding why people might be behaving in certain ways.
Right.
It doesn't mean you have to diagnose everyone in your life, but it can help you respond with more compassion even when it's difficult.
This deep dive has been so insightful. We've explored so much from those ancient myths to modern research and all the subtle ways narcissism shows up in our lives.